All right, what do you know? It's Monday again. Man, that was fast, wasn't it? Yes, it was. All right, so it looks like everyone's pretty much here. So why don't we get started? So we're actually just started chapter 7. Let's see. Yeah, let's just carry on. So one thing I did though, and soon enough we'll start working on these. Yeah, go ahead, Noah.
When's the midterm?
Fairly soon now. I'm glad you mentioned that because I want to show everyone something. Let me see. I have to go find Moodle now. I did add some new things to the Moodle that are directly relevant to your question. Here we go. Oops, no. All right. Moodle is down here somewhere. So right here, there we go. So now somewhere along the way, I guess I was supposed to do this a little sooner, but there's now a problem set for each of chapters 3 and 4, not so much 1 and 2. There's not a lot of actual problems in those chapters, but 3 and 4 definitely do. So I think, if I remember correctly from last time I taught this class, that the first 4 chapters, I believe, ended up being the first midterm. I'll double check that, but yeah, I'm almost positive. So I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll make an announcement, but what I would like to do is when we're done with this chapter 7, our inflation discussion, then we can start focusing our attention on having a midterm. And so I'm pretty sure, but like I said, I'll double check this, that the first midterm was meant to cover the first 4 chapters. So before we get to that point, we have to do 2 things. We have to do the problem sets from those chapters, and then we'll have what's called the sample midterm, which is basically a collection of all the different types of problems that we ran into in the first 4 chapters. And then I will post the midterm and you'll be able to download it, and you'll have about a week to finish it at home. All right. And then you'll send it back to me. What you'll probably end up having to do is take pictures of it and send it back to me by email. That's what I've been doing in the past, and so far it's worked out reasonably well. There's always snafus when you try to use technology, but that's how it's going to work. But we're not quite ready just yet. First, let's wrap up chapter 7, which might take the rest of the week, and then we can start thinking about that. But in the meantime, if you want to get started, you can start working on these 2 problem sets, chapter 3 and 4, because we'll have to do those before we start reviewing the sample midterm. Now, I've heard horror stories from people at other schools where they'll actually have a test, which is, it's not only online, but somehow they've figured out a way that they can actually watch you somehow through your camera. And if your eyes move in the wrong direction, apparently they make a note of it or some nonsense like that. I don't know if you've ever experienced that, but that's the opposite of what we'll be doing. You'll be doing everything at home on your own, in your own time, and you'll be able to use all your notes. And all I want you to do is demonstrate that you understand what we've been doing. That's it. There's no intention to trick you. There won't be any cameras watching you, for God's sake. It'll just be a take-home exam. It's just that simple. All right. You're welcome. Yes. So do not panic. All right. There's nothing to panic about. All right, literally nothing to panic about. We don't like to panic, do we? No, especially when there's no need for it. You should panic if your house is on fire, but for anything short of that, don't panic. All right, just no, it'll be fine. All right, if you've been following along, if you can do the problem sets, you'll have no trouble whatsoever with the test. All right. All right. Anyway, so we're going to get back here and briefly get back into this discussion about inflation, but I also have some fun new videos for us. And let's see. First, I have to check my list to remind myself what was the last one we looked at. We have a few more. There's something about inflation that brings out videos. I don't know why. There's so many good videos about inflation that it's almost like it's an embarrassment of riches. But there's certain ones that I think are especially useful to watch. And also when we're done, we're going to introduce a topic which isn't really in the book, and it's called bubbles, okay? In other words, a bubble basically means that the price of an asset has risen dramatically faster than you would be able to explain through economic fundamentals. And so these have happened throughout history. And so we will eventually get to that part, but we will first show you a very interesting historical episode in which a bubble was created. And we're going to see how it happened and what were the consequences. So it's kind of not exactly the same thing as inflation, because inflation refers to a change in all prices across the board. With a bubble, there's only one asset whose price is experiencing a dramatic increase. In fact, some people might claim that Bitcoin has experienced a bubble because of the way the price goes up and down the way it does. In fact, why don't we check this out for a second? We can go look at the price of Bitcoin. Ooh, maybe not on here. Oh, wait a minute. Does anyone here actually follow these, what are they called, cryptocurrencies?
Yeah, crypto.
Yeah, you do. Okay.
It's 50,660 right now.
Yes. Now let's see where it's been in the past. Now look at this. Last year it was $8,000 and now it's $50,000. Now it's hard to say while this is going on, but some people might suggest that this actually is a bubble, and that at some point people will realize that there's no way this is worth $50,000, and then they will start to sell it and the price will collapse. And if this is, and then after the fact, we can say, well, what do you know? This was a bubble. But we're going to see a video, not today, but next time, where we see what bubbles are and how they form. And usually the consequences are pretty disastrous when they do happen. But we're going to look at a very interesting historical episode in which a bubble formed. And in fact, it was actually a long time ago. It was in 17th century Holland. So this is not something new. So not at all. But a lot of people would argue that this price run up is actually the result of a bubble. And who's to say with something like this, because it's such a mysterious thing, not something you can put your hands on or point to it and say, this is a Bitcoin. Although every time you see an article about Bitcoin, they have this cool little coin with a B on it. I don't know, why do they do that? This thing. Yeah, now that looks cool, but it isn't, there is no actual coin, is there? No. Look at that.
All those are just like fake. Actually, I have one of those, actually, those weird coin things. Some are actually made of silver though. They're kind of cool.
It is cool. If that was a real Bitcoin, everyone could understand what the thing is, but it doesn't seem to work that way. There's no physical presence for a Bitcoin. It's a computer generated number of some kind. And somehow it has value. And I don't understand any of it. But there it is.
I had to bring up a Zoom meeting, and I'm not actually a participant, but I'm supposed to be sort of checking in on it.
So yeah, this is
but here's the problem.
Okay.
My cock is sticking straight up.
Clock is sticking straight up?
Because I have it sticking out.
Wow.
Steve, you're not muted.
Yeah, I mean, when I get enough of it.
Somebody's saying something they shouldn't have on our recording here. Wow. Look at that. Well, let's just say that I don't think there's any way well, all right, let's just carry on. Let's just continue with what we were talking about. But anyway, yes, so I think you'll find this very interesting. It's not exactly a traditional topic, asset bubbles. In fact, a lot of people, you don't normally see this written up in basic economics textbooks, but it's an important idea because it does periodically arise. And that's what made me think of it, this notion of Bitcoin. Now, who knows? It may turn out to be that Bitcoin is the greatest investment of all time, and it may turn out that it's not. Well, there's that too. It's definitely restricted in quantity. It is similar to why the US dollar has value, except that it is, yes, that's true. That's apparently one of the big attractions. It is independent of national governments. It doesn't, the dollar is issued by the US government, or actually the Federal Reserve System. And so therefore the Fed actually controls how much money is in circulation. They decide how many dollars there are out there. The Bitcoin, I don't really know who makes these decisions. There's the thing, I don't know enough about it.
Yeah, well, with Bitcoin, it's mined all the time. Like they use computers to mine it to make more. But it's called a Bitcoin halving, where the the amount of Bitcoin that's allowed to be mined every day is cut in half. So meaning that there will be a time where you're not allowed to make or mine any more Bitcoin. So there's a certain amount that will be, and they can't make any more or anything like that. So the fact is that there will be more. They'll be harder to get later, and they're scarce.
Now, I have a couple of questions for you though. First of all, can you spend them?
Yes.
Okay. Secondly, can you put them in a bank and earn interest?
Well, there's other things you can have cold storage wallet where you can transfer your cryptocurrencies, not just Bitcoin, any other cryptocurrencies, onto a cold storage wallet. And there's also wallets on your phone you can have. Um, there's paper wallets, but I'm not so educated with paper wallets. But yeah, you can like if you like have, let's say, a PO box, and you just put them, and you put them in there and they're safe. No one can reach them.
Huh, interesting. Well, you know what? I do my best to try to understand this stuff, but so far it hasn't been very successful. But yes, it is a potential candidate, at least for an asset bubble, in the sense that the price has gone up very dramatically. The question is why? And you're right, that's a lot to do with it. A lot of it has to do with the fact that the supply is limited.
Yeah.
But yet, look how much it's gone up. I mean, I don't know. It seems like maybe you can make the case that people have gotten a little carried away and they bid up the price to ridiculously high levels. And we'll find out eventually.
Yeah.
You know, like you may, well, we'll discuss this when we get to that point, but in the past, when there were bubbles, usually the price just collapsed and it never really recovered.
Yeah.
The thing about Bitcoin is it goes through these ups and downs, though. It'll suddenly lose a third of its value overnight, and then all of a sudden it's doubling in a year. So
Mhm.
I think part of the issue here is that nobody, in spite of what they say, I don't think most people really understand it.
Yeah, as I understand.
And that sort of contributes to the mystique of it, which may be part of the reason why people are paying so much money for it. But
Mhm.
oh boy, this is an interesting idea. It's like with the other asset bubbles, at least everyone understood what the asset was.
Yeah.
They just thought that it was more valuable than it really turned out to be. But anyway, so we'll save this for later. Right now, our job is to go over inflation. Now, inflation right now in the United States is really, really low. It's less than 2%. And so for that reason, you don't see it discussed in the news very often. Other things right now are taking higher priority. But during periods when inflation is higher than usual, then the media has lots of articles about it because people start to get concerned because, of course, what inflation does is it reduces the purchasing power of our dollars. So that's why it's a real problem, especially for people who live on fixed incomes like retirees. Inflation is extremely bad news. So what we want to understand is what it is, how it works, and how is it measured. And so first, let's see. We're going to focus right now on the so-called CPI, Consumer Price Index. The reason why we do that is because this one is meant to represent how much does the cost of living change. Okay, so the focus is exclusively on consumer products. There are other measures that we'll look at later on, which are more broad-based and include everything, including things that you and I do not normally buy, like crude oil, for example, or minerals, or grains and things like that. Things that we don't directly buy. But here we're focused on final products that you and I might buy in the store. And so the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a huge job here. What they have to do is actually sort of try to figure out what they call a typical urban family of four might buy during a given year. So they've got this fictional family in mind, and they try to decide what would they buy during a normal year. And then they have to go out and figure out what the prices are of those goods and determine, how much the cost of living has gone up. So it's a big ordeal for them, but, they manage to do it every month. So I imagine there's an army of people working on this, but so they create what's called a basket. And I think I already showed some of this to you last time. Let's go see if we can find the basket. Okay. There we go. I think this is it. No, that's just the recent history of the CPI, which started out in 1980, in the range from 1982 to 84. That range of years is assigned a number of 100, just to act as a starting point. And so we call that the base year or base period. And so the reason why they do that is so that you can tell during any given year, like right now, the last number we have is January. That tells me that prices are about 2.6 times what they were in the early 80s. Now, you might say, well, that sounds like a lot of inflation, but let's just do a little experiment here. Since let's say it's 2021 and the base year started in 1982. How many years is that? That's about, let's say that's 39 years. It took 39 years for the price to go up by 2.6 times its original level. What annual rate of inflation does that work out to be? Well, let's find out. That's about 2.5% per year. Okay, so in other words, over the last 39 years, our inflation rate has averaged roughly 2.5% per year. That's fairly normal in the United States, although it's actually been lower in recent years even than that. In fact, if we picked, let's say, the last 10 years, let's try that one. Let's just for the fun of it, you might be interested to see how it's been, let's say, just over the last 10 years. And I suspect that we'll find that it's been even lower than that. Okay, so we got 10 years. The ratio is the current CPI over what it was in January 2011. We raise that to, the exponent is 1 over the number of years. Then we subtract 1. And we have, yeah, there you go. I figured as much, 1.7%. So what do you suppose would be an important reason why our inflation rate is actually falling from already relatively low levels? What would be the number one thing that you would think would cause our prices to stop rising so much? Okay, now you've got an example of it right in front of you. What am I thinking of? It starts with a T. E. All right, I'll start handing it to you one letter at a time. Are we getting it?
Technology.
That's it. That's it. What does technology have to do with anything? What does technology do for us? Why is it so wonderful?
Makes life easier.
It makes life easier, but really, in addition to that, of course it does. Yes, it makes life more fun too. I think you'll agree. Just think how dreary your life would be if you didn't have an iPhone. Okay, maybe not dreary, but less fun than it is now. So, but what it does is make it less expensive to produce a lot of goods and services. In other words, not all of them, of course, but many goods and services are cheaper to produce than they were 20 years ago because of advancements in technology. So that's why I think that that really could be considered the top reason why our inflation rate keeps dropping. And in fact, let's just one more experiment here. Let's go back only 5 years and see what's going on in the last 5 years. Okay, so I'll subtract one from the other. And then I'll take the ratio of this year's CPI over 5 years ago, raise that to the 1/5 power. Oh no, unfortunately, it seems to have rebounded a tiny bit. I'm a little surprised to see that. But still, that's low. That is really low. By historical standards, for most countries, that is exactly what they'd like to see. 2% or so is what the central bank would like to see. It's not really good for it to be zero because, surprisingly enough, you might think that this would not be a problem, but and we'll discuss this in the slides anyway, but if prices are actually falling, let me make this bigger so you can actually see it. And that does happen. This is known as deflation. And in fact, Japan has experienced this in recent years, deflation, which you might think is a good thing, but it turns out that that is not actually the case at all. Deflation, as we'll see later on in the chapter, is a problem because it means that debts become more expensive. And that's a big deal in a society like ours that's heavily financed by debt. Okay, you get the United States is not exactly a big saving country. Um, not really. People in the United States do not like to save. And so, a lot of people have a lot of debt, student loans, mortgages on their houses, credit cards, you name it. And so that causes debts to become more expensive, and that could be a real problem. And in fact, the last time we experienced that in the United States was during the Great Depression. So that tells you something that, maybe this is not a good thing. So the central bank would like to avoid that. And so for the most part, most countries in the West, at least, aim for a 2% inflation rate. That seems to be about the rate at which prices don't rise too rapidly to, cause us to feel actual pain from it, but it allows room for the economy to expand. And so 2% is more or less the target of what we're aiming for. So that's where we are right now, and this is good, but not other countries so much. In fact, I think maybe last time we may have started to look at a chart. I forgot. Let's go find it again. Just a quick reminder. I'm pretty sure we found this last time, and we're looking at it, and what happened? I was looking for a chart, and they did mention along the way some countries with some preposterously high inflation rates. Like, whoa, these are some serious numbers. But realistically, anything above 10% is quite significantly very high. The United States is down here towards the bottom. Where are we? 1.5 at the moment. Okay, yeah, right now at this point in time, we're really down there. Wonder if any countries have negative inflation rates. Japan is often right on the borderline there. Well, look at this. Switzerland has negative inflation. How do you like that? Well, I don't know what's going on in Eritrea. They must be having a disaster of some kind. But so, yeah, and you can compare them all side by side. Mostly, a lot of the Western European countries, like France and Italy, usually theirs is quite a bit higher than in the United States. Let's see where I can find. I wonder if there's any way I can sort this by name. I'm not so sure. Let's see. Oh, no, it doesn't look like it. Although I can download it and sort it myself, I guess. That might be fun. All right, there we go. So if we need to look for a particular country, we can do it. I mean, let's face it, there's a lot of countries here. So let's just pick out a few and see what we can discover. Canada is only 0.9. Wow, not bad. How about France? No, 0.7. That surprises me because they really traditionally have had much higher inflation rates. Man. Japan, 0.4. Yeah, they're usually very close to 0. What else do we have? Maybe we could find Germany. They're usually very low, 1.4, right? That's about where we are. Let's see. Mexico, 3.25, not bad. They traditionally had a very high inflation rate, but they seem to have been able to knock it down to 3.25. Let's see. Any others that might jump out off the page at you? United States, 1.5. England, about the same. United Kingdom, 1.5. Yeah, at this point in time, inflation is lower in general than it's been in quite a long time. The world goes through these cycles. Like in the late 70s, early 80s, inflation is at very high levels, but that's because oil prices were going up very quickly. So you get through these cycles where inflation throughout the entire world goes through ups and downs. Right now, it's kind of at a low ebb, whereas these rates are quite a bit lower than they would have been, let's say, 10 or 20 years ago. But anyway, with all that being said, why don't we take a look at what the CPI does. Now, the CPI has a couple of versions, but what we're really focused on is what's called CPI-U, the urban version. In other words, it's meant for urban households. And so the market basket, oh yes, let's go look at the market basket. These are the basic categories in the market basket, but it gets much more specific than this. If you want to see all the different items that belong in here, the list, even this is a very broad set of categories. You can see what they've done is food, for example, is broken up into all these different categories. Food away from home means restaurants. We have energy, fuel, motor fuel, gas, et cetera, et cetera. We have, now, if you notice, they do go out of their way to split off energy and food from the rest of these categories because energy and food prices tend to be very volatile, meaning that they can bounce around dramatically over time and give us a very distorted view of the rate of inflation. So sometimes you hear reported in the media something called the core CPI, which I'll write down here somewhere for you. The core CPI, if you ever run across that in your reading, equals in overall inflation minus food and energy prices. Okay, right? Overall inflation means including those, and again, the reason why they tended to report that separately is because food and energy prices are very volatile, which means they can change very rapidly. And so by including those in the overall measure of inflation, that can give us a very distorted view of what the overall inflation rate looks like. Okay, so we keep those out when we report core CPI, but overall CPI does include both of those. And what else is in here? Let's just quickly check real fast. And by the way, what's interesting is these numbers in this column, it says relative importance. These are the percentages. So in other words, the CPI is saying that food for this average urban family of 4 represents roughly 14% of their annual expenditures, of which 6% or slightly under half is coming from restaurants. Or not just restaurants, like fast food and things like that. As long as you're not at home when you're eating, that falls into this category. Man, some of these, let's look at these categories for a minute. Fruit and vegetables, that's a big one. Meat, poultry, and eggs and fish, and that's good. I guess people are trying to eat more healthy. Then we have all the energy categories. Here we go. Here's some interesting ones. Apparel, that's clothes, of course. New cars, used cars, medical, wow. Alcoholic beverages, 1.038. Ooh, so that 0.792 for dairy and related products. So I guess Americans as a whole drink more alcohol than they eat eggs, no, not eggs, milk and cheese, I guess, fall into that category. I don't know if that's a good thing or not. How about, let's see, what else do we have down here? Oh, tobacco. Ooh, well, that's going down, of course. Shelter, which means, of course, rent. Medical services, transportation, of course, and then and that pretty much is it. But if you want to find out more details, they have everything you could possibly want on their website, and you can break these down into much smaller categories. But what they're going to do now is go out and shop, literally, and they're going to take all these prices and they're going to multiply them by these weights to come up with the CPI. And so they have a single number that represents the cost of living, and that's all based on a comparison with the base year of 1982. And then we can calculate the inflation rate by just looking at the percentage difference from one year to the next. Okay, so in fact, that's what I was actually doing here. I was calculating the percentage changes from one year to the next, except that it wasn't 1 year, it was like 5 or 10 years, or whatever the case was. Okay, so these are percentage changes in the CPI. So in the media, when they talk about the rate of inflation, they typically are referring to percentage changes in the CPI. Okay, that's normally what they're referring to. Very nice. Okay, now, so we've already seen this. And so altogether, oh, by the way, they don't just do this all in one part of the country. They spread this out over 38 geographic areas because, you know, obviously prices can be different in one part of the country to the next. So they're trying to average it out to a certain degree. And you can see altogether, they need to have 8,018 different prices to come up with this CPI. And that's every month. How do they do it? I don't know. They must have a lot of people working there. But having said that, they do have separate indexes for different parts of the country. So for example, if you want to know what prices look like in the Northeast versus the West Coast, they do have separate indexes for those. But the CPI-U that we hear in the media is meant to represent the entire country. Okay. So now the prices are based on current prices and what we call base year prices. Now, what is that all about? So the base year is this range from 82 to 84. Why did they choose those years? Because prior to 82, the US had just come through a period where inflation was quite high, as a matter of fact. And finally, it settled down to more normal levels around 1982. And it stabilized through that period. And they must have decided, you know what, this is as good a place as any to start the series, because if we go back too far, we'll be including those very highly inflationary years from the late 70s to the early 80s. So right now, the way things stand, the base year is that period in the early 80s when prices were very stable. And so they are assigned a value of 100 so that we have a basis for comparison with all the rest of the years. Now, here's a simple example of what this is all about. Suppose a small economy produces only two goods, fish and chips. Now, this is a British thing, but we're allowed to have this in the United States too. Now, in England, chips doesn't mean what it means here. They're talking about French fries. Okay, so if you go to a fish and chips place in England and say, give me fish and chips, they're not going to give you fish and potato chips. You're going to get French fries with your fish. And they're going to wrap it all up in a big piece of paper, and you're going to have the option of putting ketchup on your fries, hopefully not on your fish. And so we're going to assume that this small economy, maybe it's a tiny little island off of the UK, and all they make is fish and chips. All right. So in 2016, the price of the fish was $10, the chips was $4, and we see the quantities that they made. The CPI basket was worth $1,600. Okay, now what about the next year? Well, next year the prices went up, and I believe so did the quantities. Okay, so that added up to $1,920. And so, let me jump ahead a little bit here. The CPI in the first year would have been 100, because what they were doing is taking the CPI basket using the current prices over the same basket from the previous year's prices, and then the next year it went up to 120. So therefore, we conclude that the inflation rate in 2017 was 20%. Okay, so it's really just that simple. By the way, if you go back to this chart real fast, you'll see that in the years prior to the base year, the numbers are less than 100. Okay, that's what you would expect. In other words, you see right around here, before that period began, well, actually, they sort of averaged this all out, but let's go back a little further. Oh, they don't have any older ones. But anyway, the logic here is this. Years prior to the base year, the CPI should be less than 100, but assuming inflation is positive, okay? If we don't have deflation, CPI should go up. In future years, it should be lower in previous years prior to the base year. All right, now we've already seen this before. Inflation is just a percentage difference from the CPI in one year to the next, which in this case was approximately 20%. And that's where the word inflation comes from. I mean, it's just an increase, the percentage increase in the cost of living. And that's really all that it is. All right. Now, like with GDP, there are problems with the CPI. There's always problems with everything that we try to do. Okay. Like what? Well, for one thing, it doesn't capture everything. Not every single good that's produced in the economy is in the CPI basket. How could it be? You can't have everything. I mean, there's 8,000 series as it is. What else do you expect them to do? Somewhere back, yes, 8,018 different values. They can only do so much. Okay, so number two. Now, but it's more than just that. It does not measure the value of goods that are not consumed by individuals. For example, it doesn't capture raw materials. And if raw material prices are rising, you'd never notice it in the CPI. And yet, that's eventually going to cost us more money because that translates into higher prices down the road. So it's missing some consumer products. It's also missing what we would call producer products, meaning raw materials and metals and minerals and things like that. Now, another problem is that the CPI doesn't capture always the impact of new goods because the basket takes time to be updated. So when a new product is introduced, it doesn't necessarily find its way into the CPI basket for a while. It could take years, as a matter of fact. And not only that, but what else changes? It's the weights. The weights can change. So in other words, if you're looking back over the last 20, 30 years, the tobacco consumption, as you know, would be lower than it was in the past. So it can take time before changes in consumer spending patterns are reflected in the CPI. Okay, so it's going to always be a little bit off because, again, it cannot be updated that quickly because it's such a big project. So it's going to leave out the impact of new goods, and it's going to leave out changes in the weights, or at least initially, because it takes time for those to be reflected in the CPI. So typically, and also, yeah, it doesn't really tell us anything about quality improvements. So in other words, if you have, let's say, a computer built this year and a computer built 5 years ago, even if they were the same price, they're certainly not the same thing, are they? And so the CPI doesn't have the ability to distinguish between newer and more updated products and older products, because everything in the CPI is basically thrown into a fairly broad category like computers. But we know that the quality of the computers keeps improving. And so the CPI can't really capture that effect. Okay. So, and cars too, like cars keep getting better. TVs, that's right. Oh my God, have they gotten cheaper? Yeah, they've really fallen in price. And it's all about, again, the technology. It's 100% due to that technology. The more it improves, the cheaper it will be to buy products and the better they will be. So the CPI is sort of, it's kind of like a big, I compare it maybe with like, remember the story about the tortoise and the hare? The tortoise just sort of plods along, and I think he ends up winning the race somehow. But but yes, the CPI is a little bit like the tortoise. It sort of plods along, and it gets improved a little bit here and there, but it's still considered to be the most reliable of all of the measures that we have for inflation. But the BLS is constantly working on improvements. And by the way, I also want to mention here too that all of these flaws cause the CPI to overstate the rate of inflation somewhat. So the numbers that you're seeing, like 1.4% for January, are probably a bit overstated. The true rate of inflation is probably lower than that. Now, here's one of the real problems with it: the substitution bias. Now, what does that mean? Well, this comes back to the idea of the weights that we're assuming hold for consumers for all these different goods and services that we can buy. Suppose, for example, the price of chicken suddenly goes up significantly. What might people do as a result of that? Okay, what would you do? Imagine yourself going to the supermarket and shopping, and you say, oh, what happened here? Chicken went up 30% in price. What might your response be? Well, how about, yeah, here we go, good. How about if you buy something else? Yes, beef or fish or something different, which is cheaper. All right, well, the brands, let's say they all went up in about the same price. So you can't do any good, you can't save money with brands, but just chicken in general, for whatever reason, suddenly became much more expensive. Well, the problem with that, though, is that that means that the weights are no longer accurate, especially, well, there's that too. But let's just say that even allowing for that, the price is quite a bit higher than it used to be. Yes, it's true. If you're willing to cut it up yourself, you can save a lot of money with chicken, but man, it's a lot of work. If you've ever tried to do it, it's a lot of work. But yes, if you're good at it, you should do it. But what's going to happen now is that the weights will be distorted because the CPI shows that the same amount of chicken is being consumed and people are paying the higher price for it, when in reality, a lot of people have switched to something that's cheaper. So this is a main reason why the CPI tends to overstate the rate of inflation, because it doesn't capture, or at least not right away, the impact of people switching from one good to another as the price changes. So in other words, and you notice it's called the substitution bias. If you recall, substitute goods are goods that both satisfy the same needs. And so because of this, if chicken goes up, we can switch to fish and save money. So the CPI misses out on that because it takes a long time for the weights to be adjusted. So this is another main reason why CPI tends to somewhat overstate the true rate of inflation. Now, it turns out that, yes, it's a little too high, but it's not way off either. Economists have estimated that the CPI is a little too high by approximately 0.1%. So in other words, if they tell you that the inflation rate is 2%, it's probably really 1.9%, which is not a big deal, but it can add up. Now, why is that? Well, look what can happen. A lot of contracts may be tied to the CPI. Like, for example, a union may have a clause in their contract which says that their wages have to at least go up enough to match the CPI. If the CPI is too high, then the union raises will be higher than they otherwise would have been. Or Social Security is also tied to CPI. So that means that maybe these people are getting bigger raises than they really need to offset the increase in the cost of living. And in the federal tax code, a lot of deductions are tied to the CPI. They're indexed for inflation. And again, if the CPI is distorted, that can cost the Treasury a lot of revenues. Pensions, exactly. A lot of economic activity is tied to that CPI. So the more accurate it is, the better off we'll be. But again, yes, they're constantly doing research to figure out better ways of making this a better measure, but it still is a little too high, okay? And they know that, and they're still constantly working on it, but it still has issues. But having said that, it is very reliable compared to other measures that you could use. And so we continue to use it, but we have to take it with a grain of salt, of course. Just like any other economic measure, it can never be perfect, can it? No. All right, now with all that being said, we have enough background that we're ready for some more fun videos. All right, not the bubble. We'll save that for another time. The bubbles can come later because the bubbles are somewhat of a different topic, but we have some more fun videos here that we have not yet watched. I've been saving them. And so let's see what we're going to get here today. We got a few. Oh my God. They're all fun in their own way, and they're all very informative as well. So here we go. Let's start with the first one. And this one we've kind of already discussed, but I think it's worth our while to watch another video about Zimbabwe because it's sort of like a cautionary tale as to what can go wrong when a government starts printing money to pay its bills. All right, so let's check this out.
Also, an example of the U.S. after the Revolutionary War. They did the same thing, basically,
Yes.
except not to as high of a level. That's where the phrase "not worth a continental" came from.
That's right. part is everyone more or less done? Did you now was I thought it was interesting. Besides, obviously, the video was about the $100 trillion bill, which we'll probably never see again. Um, but I thought it was more fun to notice in the beginning when he was showing the Monopoly set. Obviously, the person who did this video is English, and so it appears that the British version of Monopoly is based on London. Okay, did you notice those properties like Trafalgar Square? That was pretty cool, and that raises an interesting trivia question. Who knows what city American Monopoly is based on?
Atlantic City.
That's right. It's Atlantic City, New Jersey. Yes. So it's the same exact game in every country, only they change the names of the properties, but it's the same. And it's kind of fun to look at them and see what properties they chose in all those other versions. So, but anyway, so that was our a little introduction again to inflation. But now we're going to be looking at it from more of a macro perspective. This next video is entitled Why Governments Create Inflation. In other words, why did Zimbabwe do what they did? Why did they print all those dollars knowing that they would cause all that inflation? What exactly was their motivation? So that's what this next video is all about, the reasons behind why this actually happens. All right, so I think you'll find this to be a lot of fun. So let's check this one out. And let's take a look at it. All right, so I guess we're all done with that. So now I didn't realize initially that they were going to go over something that we haven't actually seen yet, and that is this thing he keeps talking about, MV equals PY. So let's just quickly go over that and see what that is all about. So this is a theory, was developed, well, I'm going to say probably the 18th century, maybe. And this is sometimes called the equation of exchange. And it's a very simple theory. So what we have here is M is the nominal money supply, which we'll discuss in great detail later on in the course. Just think of it as the number of dollars that are in circulation. Now, this is the mystery term. We haven't seen anything like this before. It's called velocity. And that basically refers to how many times a dollar is spent during the year. P is the overall price level. You can think of that as the CPI. And then Y is real or inflation adjusted. GDP. So the equation of exchange says that the product of the nominal money supply and velocity equals PY, which when you bring those together, because P is the price level and Y is real GDP, PY actually gives us nominal GDP. Okay, now what he was discussing was a short run version of this equation of exchange where we frequently assume, just to keep things simple, that V and Y are fixed in the short run, that they don't change very rapidly. And if that's the case, here's what the consequence of this will be. So, and by the way, when he puts a little bar over something in an equation, that means that it is being held constant. Okay, so what we have here then is that PMV equals PY. If we assume that we're in the short run when velocity and real GDP are constant, here's what happens. So these are assumed to be constant in the short run. That means that any increase in M is exactly matched by an increase in P. And so in other words, just as a quick example of that, if M goes up 10%, then the price level will go up 10%. There'll be no impact on GDP. So therefore, if Robert Mugabe increases the money supply by 1,000%, there'll be no impact on the real economy. Instead, prices will go up by 1,000%. So when the government prints money, they're increasing M, and all they're really doing is increasing P. They're not having any influence on Y. And even if that was their intention, because sometimes governments think that they can stimulate the economy by increasing the money supply. And like they said in the video, that might work for a very short period of time, but then people begin to recognize that prices are going up and that they're wasting their time working harder. So instead they start spending their money more quickly. And before you know it, we have a very high rate of inflation, which is almost impossible to stop without causing a full collapse of the economy, which is exactly what happened in Zimbabwe. Now, they've since replaced their currency with another one, and Mugabe is gone too. Although I don't know all the details. But this is what happens when an economy suffers through a significant amount of inflation. They often end up having to retire that currency and replace it with a completely new one. In fact, something like that happened in Brazil in the 90s. I'll just mention this in passing. Maybe I can find a video about this. In 1994, Brazil's currency, the Cruzeiro, it was called, was wiped out by inflation, and it was replaced by what they have now, which is called the real. Okay, now as it turns out, unlike a lot of other countries who've gone through this, when they replaced the currency with the real, they also committed themselves to having a much more responsible monetary policy, meaning that they were not going to crank up the printing presses and just pay for everything with printed money. And in fact, it's worked quite well. They've still got the same currency. Here it is 25 years later. And they really meant what they said, apparently, because the real has been very stable ever since then. But it doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes the new currency is just as bad as the old one. It depends on the government, it depends on the central bank. But this equation of exchange is just a very simple way of explaining why increasing the money supply without any increase in output is simply going to result in more inflation. Okay, so this model is often used to illustrate what we're doing here. Even though it's very simplistic, it does give us a good sense of how money and prices are related to each other. So anyway, now we're going to move on to another fun video, which this time we're looking at Venezuela, the sad case of Venezuela. You saw before when we were looking at that chart of inflation rates, Venezuela's inflation rate is through the roof. The question is why? So this is going to be sort of like a follow-up to Zimbabwe, except now it's Venezuela. All right, so let me send this off to you. And we're going to see the sad case of Venezuela. Crimes in every city, constant electric blankets. Wow, that was pretty scary, huh? But that's, yeah, I mean, so what they're doing here more so than the other video is just showing just how much hyperinflation harms the population. And you know how it's, once it gets started, it's incredibly difficult to get it stopped. Occasionally, you know, like with Brazil, they were able to pull it off, but their inflation rate hadn't gotten to the levels that Venezuela's have. And they also had a much more diversified economy than Venezuela, which really, with all that oil wealth, they really should have found ways to diversify their output, but it never really happened. So that's why, one of the reasons why they're in so much trouble. But anyway, so I guess we can stop right here. And we'll carry on next time. We'll continue our discussion of inflation, but at some point we'll also introduce a brief look at bubbles, asset bubbles, because it's somewhat related to inflation, but also because it's just a very interesting topic. And I think you'll agree with me when you see the video about the bubble that took place in Holland. You'll find it extremely interesting and kind of surprising that something like that could happen. But then it'll turn out that there's much more recent examples of this anyway. So anyway, so I guess unless there's any last minute questions, we can stop right here. And I'll see you all on Thursday.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you.
See you later.